The letter was already written. Eva Reed found it on her desk the morning of the last day of autumn, folded into a small square and sealed with a dab of candle wax, and the moment she unfolded it and read the childish, earnest handwriting inside, her hands began to shake. "Dear Miss Reed," it began, in the careful, looping script of a 9-year-old trying her very hardest, "we do not want you to go. Papa does not know we are writing this, but we talked about it, and Eli said you should stay forever, and Nora said that is only possible if you marry Papa, and Eli said yes, and so we are asking you please. Papa is sad all the time except when you are here. You make the house smell like something good. We think you could love us if you tried, and we already love you, so it is a good start. Please do not go back to Boston. Yours truly, Adelaide Monroe, age 9, and Eli Monroe, age 7, who cannot write as good as me yet." Eva sat down in her chair so quickly that it scraped against the rough wooden floor with a sound like a sob. Outside, beyond the single glass window of the schoolhouse she had spent the last 4 months building into something worthy of the name, the Montana sky was pressing down low and gray, the kind of sky that warned you winter was not coming but already here, crouching just beyond the ridge line. She had a train ticket in her bag. She had a letter from her sister in Boston asking when she was coming home. She had a position waiting for her at a proper school, a school with a real roof and a piano, and more than 11 students spread across 4 grade levels. She had Cornelius Monroe's face in her mind as clearly as if he were standing in front of her, which he was not, because Cornelius Monroe never made things easy, and the one thing he had never once done was ask her to stay. She pressed the children's letter against her chest and breathed. This was the trap she had not seen coming, not the harsh winters, not the isolation of Garnet Creek, Montana, population 163 souls scattered across 10 miles of high plains and rock, not the loneliness of the first weeks when she had arrived in September of 1884 with 2 trunks and an education and an absolute certainty that she could handle anything a frontier town threw at her. The trap was this: a piece of paper with 2 children's names on it and the most straightforward declaration of love she had ever received in her 28 years of life, and it had not come from the man she wanted it from. It had come from his children instead. She needed to go back to the beginning. She needed to understand how she had arrived at this morning, in this chair, with this letter, because the truth of it was that she had been walking toward this moment since the first afternoon. She had climbed down from the stagecoach, and Cornelius Monroe had been standing there with his hat in his hand, and his jaw set like carved stone, and his 2 small children pressed against his legs like shadows. Eva Reed had grown up in Cincinnati, Ohio, the second of 4 daughters of a schoolteacher father and a mother who had opinions about everything and was right about most of them. She had been educated formally, which was not common for women of her generation, because her father believed that an ignorant woman was a waste of a perfectly good mind. She had taught at a small school in Cincinnati for 3 years. She had been engaged once, briefly, to a man named Gerald who had a fine coat and very little else to recommend him, and when the engagement ended it had been her decision, and everyone in her social circle had been scandalized and secretly relieved for her. Then the letter had come from the Montana Territorial Board of Education, forwarded through a church women's auxiliary in Cincinnati, explaining that the small community of Garnet Creek was in desperate need of a schoolteacher for the fall term and possibly the spring, and that they were offering room, board, and a monthly wage, and that the position was open to qualified women of good character. Eva had looked at Gerald's empty chair at the dining table, and then at the Cincinnati skyline through her kitchen window, and then at the letter again, and she had written back by the next post. She arrived in Garnet Creek on a Wednesday afternoon in the first week of September 1884, and the town looked like God had sketched it in pencil and then second-guessed himself. There was a main street with a general store, a livery stable, a blacksmith shop, a saloon that was also the post office on alternate days, a church that served as the schoolroom until Eva's proper schoolhouse could be finished, and 20 or so houses spreading out from there like a hand opening slowly. The mountain stood behind all of it, enormous and indifferent and heartbreakingly beautiful. The town's self-appointed welcoming committee consisted of Reverend Aldous Birch, who was 70 years old and had eyebrows like small animals, and Cornelius Monroe, who was 36 and had the look of a man who had once been soft somewhere and had let the land harden him because it was easier than grieving. Reverend Birch did all of the talking. Cornelius Monroe stood slightly apart and watched Eva with the kind of concentrated attention that made her feel simultaneously seen and unsettled, like a pinned specimen being examined by someone who was not certain what species it was. "These are Mr. Monroe's children," Reverend Birch said, steering two small bodies forward. "Adelaide, who we call Addie, and Eli." Adelaide Monroe was 9 years old, with her father's dark eyes and her mother's stubbornness written in every line of her small face. She assessed Eva with the thorough skepticism of someone who had been disappointed before and intended to be prepared for it next time. Eli Monroe was 7, gap-toothed and earnest, with a shock of dark hair that went in 3 directions and a general air of having recently escaped from somewhere. He looked at Eva with an expression of open and uncomplicated hope that was so transparent it made her chest ache. "How do you do?" Eva said to them both, crouching down to their level, which was something that always startled children who expected adults to remain at adult height. Eli said, "Do you know any stories?" Adelaide elbowed him sharply. "The question is rude," she said in the tone of someone who had said this to him many times. "It is not rude, it is practical," Eva said, looking at Adelaide with a straight face. "And the answer is yes. I know dozens of stories. Some of them are even true." Eli's face ignited like a lamp being lit. Adelaide, after a brief internal struggle that was entirely visible on the outside, allowed the corner of her mouth to flicker upward by approximately 1 degree. Cornelius Monroe said nothing, but Eva felt his eyes on her as she stood back up, and when she turned to look at him directly, he did not look away. He just kept watching her with that steady, contained attention that gave nothing and asked nothing and somehow managed to feel like an entire conversation anyway. "Mr. Monroe," she said. "Miss Reed," he said. That was all. She was shown to her accommodations, which were a room in the back of the general store owned by Margaret Holt, a woman of 55 who was entirely practical and made the best cornbread in Montana, and had very firm views about propriety and very warm views about company. The room was small and clean and had a window that faced the mountains, and Eva stood at it for a long time that first evening, watching the last of the light drain out of the sky and thinking, with something that was not quite surprise and not quite resignation, that this was going to be much more complicated than she had expected. The schoolhouse was still being built when she arrived, and for the first 3 weeks she held class in the church, which was drafty and smelled of old wood and candle smoke, and the particular cold sanctity of a space designed to remind you of your smallness. There were 11 students ranging in age from 6 to 14, which meant that Eva was essentially running 4 different levels of education simultaneously, and she discovered very quickly that she was good at it in the way that you discover a talent, which is by finding yourself doing something difficult and enjoying it more than you expected. Adelaide Monroe was the best student in the class. She was also the most guarded, the most likely to be right, and the most likely to be angry about being wrong, which Eva found deeply relatable. She helped the smaller children with their letters without being asked, which meant she had a natural impulse toward care that she was keeping very carefully hidden behind her sharp edges, and Eva filed that information away and used it gently. Eli Monroe was not the best student, but he was the most enthusiastic, which mattered more than people gave it credit for. He answered every question with complete confidence, regardless of whether he knew the answer, which was sometimes frustrating and mostly wonderful. He brought Eva a rock on the second day of school because he thought it was interesting. And it was, in fact, a piece of genuine quartz crystal, and Eva had put it on her desk, and it was still there 4 months later. Cornelius Monroe came to collect his children each afternoon, just as school let out, arriving at the church door or later at the new schoolhouse door, with the exact punctuality of someone who had arranged his entire day around this one task. He always had his hat in his hand when he came inside. He always waited quietly rather than interrupting. He always listened to whatever Eli was saying with the absolute attention of a man who understood that his son was 7 years old and every word mattered. He and Eva spoke to each other in the careful, limited way of two people who are aware that they are being watched by a small town with very little else to watch. Good afternoon. How were they today? Did Eli's arithmetic improve? Fine weather, cold coming in. The road from his ranch to town was rough after the rain. She thanked him for the firewood he had left outside the schoolhouse one morning without being asked. He said it was nothing. It was not nothing. She knew that. She thought he probably knew she knew it. The ranch where Cornelius Monroe lived with his children was 4 miles out of Garnet Creek, which in Montana in 1884 was close enough to be a neighbor and far enough to be alone. He ran cattle, enough to be solvent and not enough to be comfortable, and he did it with 2 hands named Duff and Pescado, and the particular grim competence of a man who had learned that work was the best available remedy for the kinds of loss that did not fade. His wife's name had been Clara. She had died 18 months before Eva arrived in Garnet Creek, taken by a fever in the spring of 1883 that had moved fast and given no warning and left Cornelius Monroe standing in a house with 2 children who needed him, and no idea how to be the kind of father they needed, when he was still trying to understand how to exist without the person who had made him understand that he was worth existing. Eva learned this not from Cornelius himself, who did not speak of it, but from Margaret Holt, who was not a gossip exactly, but was a person who believed that context was important, and that a new schoolteacher needed context in order to understand what she was dealing with. "He has not been easy since Clara died," Margaret said one evening, sitting across from Eva at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee and the comfortable bluntness of a woman who had earned the right to say exactly what she meant. "He was not easy before, mind you. Cornelius Monroe was never an easy man, but he was a happy man in his particular way, and now he is not, and the children feel it even when they do not say so." "Adelaide feels it," Eva said. "Adelaide feels everything," Margaret said, nodding. "She gets that from Clara, and from him. Between the 2 of them she never stood a chance at being simple." Eva thought about this for a long time after she went to bed that night, staring at the ceiling of her small room while the mountain wind pushed at the window glass. She thought about Cornelius Monroe's face when he was watching Eli explain something about the rock collection he was building. She thought about the way his expression changed, softened slightly, unlocked slightly, when he did not think anyone was looking. She thought about the fact that he had been watching her all this time, and she had been watching him, and they were both, in their different ways, pretending not to. She did not think about this being dangerous. She should have. The first time they had a real conversation was 6 weeks into the fall term, on an October afternoon when the aspens had turned the color of fire, and the air had that particular crystalline quality that the mountains get when the cold is coming in serious. Eva had stayed late at the schoolhouse, which by that point had its walls and roof, and 3 windows and a proper iron stove, grading papers by lantern light. And when she heard the knock at the door she was surprised because the children were long gone. It was Cornelius Monroe. He had a look on his face that she had not seen before, something that was not quite embarrassment and not quite apology but was in the vicinity of both. "I was in town late," he said. "I thought I would see if the stove was properly drawing. The flue can be unpredictable." They both knew the stove was drawing fine because it had been burning all day without incident. "The stove is working well," Eva said. "Good," he said. He looked at the stove. He looked at the papers on her desk. He looked at the quartz crystal Eli had given her, still sitting in its place on the corner of the desk. "He brings you things," he said. "Eli, he mentions it." "He brought me a beetle casing last week," Eva said, "and a very interesting piece of bark." The corner of Cornelius Monroe's mouth moved. "That sounds about right." "He told me it was a special bark," Eva said. "He was not wrong. I believe it was from a ponderosa pine, and the inner bark does have quite a distinctive smell. I let him explain it to the class." Cornelius was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You let him talk." "He has things to say," Eva said. "His last teacher told him to stop asking questions," Cornelius said. It was a simple statement, not particularly weighted, but she heard what was underneath it clearly enough. "That was a failure of imagination on the teacher's part," Eva said. He looked at her then directly, with the full force of that contained attention she had been aware of since the first afternoon, and it felt like standing in a beam of light. Not comfortable exactly, illuminating. "You are not what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" He thought about this seriously. "Someone older," he said. "Someone who would not last the winter." "I intend to last the winter," she said. "I know," he said. And then more quietly, "That is what I mean." She was not entirely certain what he meant by that, and she thought he was not entirely certain either, and so neither of them said anything else about it. And he left, and she sat alone in the schoolhouse with the lamp burning and her papers ungraded, and the warm iron stove filling the room with the smell of wood smoke, and something that felt dangerously like hope. After that the conversations happened more often. He found reasons to be in town a little later. She found reasons to be at the schoolhouse a little longer. They talked about his children, which was safe. They talked about the land, which he knew and she was learning. They talked about books, because Eva had brought a trunk full of them, and Cornelius Monroe, she discovered, was a reader, which was not something the town of Garnet Creek associated with him, because he kept it private with the same care he kept everything private. He had been educated, more than most, because his own father had placed the same value on it that Eva's had. He had read Scott and Dickens and things that surprised her, and when she mentioned Jane Austen with a certain careful watchfulness to see how he would respond, he said without any hesitation that Pride and Prejudice was an extremely accurate account of the damage that pride does to people who do not know they have it, and that he had read it twice. She had stared at him. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "Only I did not expect that." "You are not the only one who can be unexpected," he said, and there was something in his voice that was as close to playful as she had yet heard from him, and it was devastating in exactly the way she had been afraid it would be. She began going to the ranch on Saturday afternoons to help Adelaide with her reading comprehension, which was already excellent but which Adelaide clearly enjoyed improving because it meant she could argue with Eva about the meaning of things, which was Adelaide's favorite activity after breathing. Eva told Cornelius this was purely academic. It was mostly true. It was also true that when she arrived at the ranch each Saturday and Cornelius was there, watching her come up the path with his arms crossed and his hat slightly pushed back from his forehead in a way that meant he was more relaxed than he wanted to appear, the afternoon became the best part of her week. The ranch house was plain and well-made, the kind of house built by someone who understood structure but had not spent much time thinking about comfort. There were lace curtains that had been Clara's, and Eva was careful not to look at them too long because she understood they were sacred and not hers to have feelings about. There was a kitchen that smelled of coffee and whatever Cornelius had burned or not burned for breakfast. There were children's drawings pinned to the wall by the table, recent ones, not old ones, which told Eva that the house was not a museum of the past, but was still being lived in. Eli always met her at the door. Adelaide always pretended not to have been watching for her from the window. One Saturday in late October, Cornelius made coffee and they sat at the kitchen table while Adelaide read aloud and corrected herself sharply whenever she made errors, and Eli fell asleep with his head on Eva's arm because he had been up before dawn with Cornelius checking on a cow that had been restless, and Eva held very still and did not move her arm for the rest of the afternoon so as not to wake him. And Cornelius watched her doing this with an expression she could not name but could feel. Warm and complicated and very still, like water that has stopped moving for a reason. He walked her back to the road that evening, the way he always did, and the light was going gold and long across the grass, and the first night birds were starting in the trees, and he stopped at the gate post the way he always did, and they stood there for a moment the way they always did, which was to say they stood there and did not say the things that were accumulating between them like snow against a fence. "Same time next week," Eva said. "Same time," he said. She started to walk. Then she stopped and turned back because she had thought of something. "Mr. Monroe," she said. "Miss Reed," he said. "Your son fell asleep on my arm today because he was tired and he trusted me enough to let himself be tired. I want you to know that I do not take that lightly." He looked at her for a long time. Something moved through his face carefully, the way something careful moves through a space it is not sure is safe. "I know you do not," he said. "That is why he does it." She walked back to town through the long gold afternoon, and she was not cold at all, though by every measure she should have been. November came in hard, the way Montana Novembers do, with a sudden ferocity that is always a surprise even when you have been warned. The creek froze along its edges, and the road from the Monroe ranch to town became treacherous, and Cornelius began bringing the children to school in his wagon rather than on horseback, which meant he was sometimes still in town at midday, and which meant they had more time to talk, because Margaret Holt's kitchen was warm, and Margaret Holt made it her business to have reasons to be in the other room when interesting things were happening in the kitchen. It was on one such November midday that Eva, feeling unusually honest in the way that cold weather sometimes induces, told Cornelius about Gerald. She had not intended to. They had been talking about something entirely different, about the ethics of some disputed land boundary that was causing difficulty between two of the ranch families, and she had said something about how people always find ways to justify the things they want to take, and Cornelius had said yes and looked at her with a question in his eyes that was not about the land boundary, and she had told him about the engagement. "He was not a bad person," she said. "He was just someone who had a picture in his head of what a wife was, and I did not match it." "What did he want?" Cornelius asked. He was leaning on the table with both forearms, coffee cup between his hands, watching her with the full focus he always gave her. "Quieter," Eva said, "smaller, more willing to let things be decided for her." "And you ended it," he said. "Yes, your people gave you trouble for it." "Significant trouble," she said, "for approximately 6 months. And then they got over it," Eva said. "People generally do." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Clara wanted to move," in a tone that was careful and deliberate, the tone of someone opening a door that has been closed for a long time. "To Denver. She thought it would be better for the children, better schools, better everything. And I said no because this land is mine, because my father built this ranch, because I could not imagine being anywhere else." Eva waited. "She never argued with me about it after the first time," Cornelius said. "That should have told me something. Clara was not a woman who dropped things, but she dropped that." He looked at his coffee. "I have thought about it a great deal since she died, whether she was unhappy, whether I could have done differently." "Do you think you could have?" He lifted his eyes to hers. "Yes," he said. "I think I was afraid, and I dressed it up as principle." The honesty of it sat in the room between them like something substantial. "That is a very honest thing to say," Eva said. "You make me honest," he said. "I have not entirely decided whether that is a comfort or a threat." She laughed before she could stop herself, and he watched her laugh with something in his face that was so unguarded and so wanting that she had to look away from it before she said something she was not ready to say. The schoolhouse caught fire in the middle of November. Not seriously, not catastrophically, but the flue drew wrong one cold morning when the wind shifted and sparks got into the roof seam before anyone noticed. And by the time it was out, there was a blackened patch in the corner of the roof, and a hole the size of a wagon wheel, and several days of rain threatening overhead. The whole town came out. This was the nature of small communities, that disasters were communal, and within an hour there were 12 men with tools and wood and intentions. And Eva stood at the edge of the schoolyard feeling helpless and furious in equal measure, because she could not do anything useful with tools and wood, and she did not know how to just stand and watch. Cornelius Monroe was there. Of course he was there. He was on the roof before anyone else, moving with a sure-footed competence that made the other men look uncertain, directing rather than waiting to be directed, and it was the most decisive she had ever seen him in a practical sense, and she found it unexpectedly, uncomplicatedly attractive, which she noted with some irritation because she already had more than enough feelings about him without adding new categories. He climbed down from the roof after 3 hours with sawdust in his hair and a long scratch on his forearm from where a nail had caught him, and he walked directly over to Eva with the look of someone who has been aware of where you are the entire time and was waiting for a reason to come over. "The roof will hold until spring," he said. "I would not leave the stove burning when no one is inside until we can get a proper man to look at the flue." "Thank you," she said. She was looking at the scratch on his forearm, which was still bleeding slightly. "It is nothing," he said. "People keep saying that to me," Eva said, "and it keeps being wrong." He looked at her for a moment, and then he did something she was not expecting. He smiled. Not the fractional movement of his mouth corner she had learned to notice. An actual smile, briefly and completely, the kind that changed his whole face and showed her something warm and human and hidden that she suspected very few people had ever seen. She felt it like a physical thing. "I will come by Monday to check on the stove," he said. "I will be here," she said. He nodded and went back to his wagon, and Eli, who had been watching all of this from a safe distance with an expression of satisfied interest, caught Eva's eye and gave her a small, decisive nod, as though something had been confirmed. December came, and with it, a community Christmas gathering at the church that was also part school concert, because Eva had taught the children 3 songs and a recitation poem, and wanted the town to see what they had been doing. The children performed magnificently, and Adelaide delivered her recitation poem about the seasons with the contained intensity of a much older person, and received applause that made her stand very straight and pretend not to be delighted. Afterward there was a social, with music from 2 fiddle players and dancing, because the winter was long and people needed to dance. Eva danced with Reverend Birch, which was charming, and with Thomas Holt, Margaret's son, who was visiting from Helena, and with 2 or 3 other men who asked politely. Cornelius Monroe did not dance. He stood along the wall and watched, which was entirely in character, but when Eva happened to glance over at him, he was not watching the general room. He was watching her specifically, with an expression that was so clearly and simply unhappy about the fact that Thomas Holt had his hand on her waist that she almost walked over to him directly. But she did not, because they were in a room full of people, and she had some sense of self-preservation. The music changed to something slower, and Thomas Holt bowed himself gracefully away, and before Eva could decide what to do next, Cornelius was beside her. She had not seen him cross the room. He was simply suddenly there, standing close enough that she could smell wood smoke and cold air and something warmer underneath. "I do not dance well," he said. "I have low standards," she said. "That is a lie," he said. "True," she said, "but I will lower them for tonight." He took her hand, and her other hand went to his shoulder, and they moved in a way that was not exactly dancing, and was not exactly not dancing, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him through her dress, and the controlled tension in his hand that was keeping everything careful and measured, and the room seemed to get both louder and farther away at the same time. "I am going to say something," he said quietly, speaking toward her hair. "All right," she said. "I have not said it before because I was not sure I had the right, and I am still not entirely sure I have the right. But I am going to say it because not saying it has become more difficult than saying it." "Cornelius," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, and she felt him hear it, felt him still for just a half beat. "I do not want you to leave in the spring," he said. "I do not know what to do about that except say it." She was quiet for a moment, moving slowly with him in the not quite dancing, feeling the weight of the moment like something she wanted to carry. "I have a ticket," she said, "back to Boston. The spring term ends in April." "I know," he said. "And a position waiting," she said, "a real school." "This is a real school," he said. "I know," she said. "I know that." They moved in silence for a few seconds. Then she said very quietly, "What would you have me do instead of go?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he was not going to answer. Then he said, "That is the question I do not know how to answer yet, but I am working on it." She nodded against his shoulder, and they finished the dance and separated with the careful public distance that the situation required. And Eva went home to her room in Margaret Holt's general store and sat at her window looking at the dark mountains for a long time, feeling something large and complicated, and not entirely comfortable turning over in her chest. She was in love with him. She had probably been in love with him for some time, and had been explaining it to herself as fondness, as professional warmth, as natural human connection in an isolated place, which were all the reasonable and defensible versions of the truth. The unreasonable and indefensible version, which was also the true one, was that Cornelius Monroe had gotten into her somehow, past all the reasonable explanations, and she did not know what to do about it because loving him meant staying, and staying meant giving up things she had built and planned. And she was 28 years old, and she had been asked before to make herself smaller for someone else's world, and she had said no, and she was not going to say yes just because this time the world in question was beautiful. But the children's faces, but the way Eli's hand felt on her arm when he showed her things, but the way Adelaide looked up from her books sometimes with that rare, real, unguarded smile, but the way Cornelius Monroe smiled when he forgot not to. The dark past of her own failed engagement sat at the back of her mind like a warning. She had once thought she knew what she was choosing. She had been wrong in one direction. She could be wrong in another. She could choose this and discover she had made herself smaller in different ways, had given up the Boston position and the proper school and the life she had planned for something that turned cold or went wrong in ways she could not yet see. But then again. She went to the ranch on the last Saturday before Christmas with a tin of gingerbread she had made in Margaret's kitchen, and a book of illustrated natural history for Eli, and a collected edition of Alfred Lord Tennyson for Adelaide, who had mentioned in passing that she had once heard a poem and liked the sound of it. Cornelius met her at the gate and walked beside her up to the house, and the children came tumbling out into the cold to meet her, and Eli grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the barn because there were kittens, new kittens born just last week. Had she heard? Did she know? There were 5 and one of them was orange. She spent 20 minutes in the hay-warm barn with 3 small orange kittens in her lap, and Eli narrating their personalities, and Adelaide occasionally correcting minor factual errors. And Cornelius leaned against the barn door with his arms crossed and watched her with his children with an expression that had stopped being guarded entirely, and was just open and full and a little desperate, like a man looking at something he wanted, and was not certain he had the right to want. On Christmas Eve, Cornelius left a package at Margaret Holt's door addressed to Eva in his careful handwriting. Inside, wrapped in brown paper, was a single book. A collected edition of Jane Austen, spine cracked from reading, 2 of the pages earmarked in pencil. Inside the front cover in his handwriting he had written, "For the woman who makes me honest. C.M." She read it 3 times and then held it against her chest the same way she would hold Adelaide and Eli's letter on the last morning of autumn, 3 months from then, when everything had shifted again. Christmas Day itself was spent in church, and then in the community hall where the whole town shared a meal that was extraordinary in the way that collective effort always is, everyone bringing what they had, and it was warm and loud and alive with children. Eva sat with Margaret and ate and laughed, and was introduced to 14 people she had already met, but who wanted to formally welcome her now that she had proven herself not a summer person. Cornelius sat across from her with his children on either side of him and talked to Reverend Birch and Duff, his ranch hand, and to the Calloway family who ran the next ranch over. And twice over the course of the meal he caught Eva's eye across the table in the way that had become their private language, the brief, complete acknowledgement of each other that did not need words and was more intimate for not having them. January came in like a punishment. The cold in Montana in January is a different order of thing from the cold Eva had known in Ohio or Cincinnati. It is the kind of cold that has ambitions, that wants to get into everything, that tests the construction of houses and the fortitude of people simultaneously. The children still came to school because Garnet Creek families were not going to let a Montana winter interfere with their children's education, and also the schoolhouse was warm. Eva wore every layer she owned and was still cold until the stove had been burning for an hour. Cornelius came more often in January. He found more reasons. He was in town for supplies. He needed to speak to the Reverend. He was checking on something at the general store. Each time he found his way to wherever Eva was, and each time they talked, and each time the conversation went a little further in. He told her about his father, who had come to Montana from Virginia before the war, and built the ranch from nothing and died on it when Cornelius was 24, which was the same year he married Clara, which was both coincidence and not, because grief and love get tangled in ways that people do not always understand until later. She told him about her mother's opinions and her father's library, and the particular texture of growing up in a house where being smart was expected, and being wrong was survivable, and being dishonest was the worst possible offense. She told him she was afraid of becoming someone who stayed somewhere for someone else's reasons and then blamed the place and the someone else when she was unhappy. He said he understood that. He said Clara had been unhappy sometimes, and he had not known what to do with it, and he was not certain he would know better now. But he was certain he would try harder, which he understood was both an insufficient answer and the only honest one he had. She said she believed him. She said she was not sure what to do with believing him. They were sitting on either side of the stove in the schoolhouse when this happened, both pretending to have reasons to be there, and the wind was doing something violent outside, and the stove was making the kind of warmth that you want to press against. And Eva looked at him across the small space and thought, with a clarity that felt like something breaking and something opening simultaneously, that she was going to stay. She had not decided it yet. She was not ready to say it. But she felt it settle into her the way certainty settles, quietly and without fanfare, and she knew that the knowing was going to change the shape of everything going forward. February brought two things: a 3-day blizzard that confined the whole town to its indoors, and the decision, made somewhere in the enforced stillness of that 3-day silence, that she was done being afraid of what she felt. The blizzard cleared on a Saturday, and everything was brilliant, unreasonably white, the mountains made new and enormous under fresh snow. Eva walked to the Monroe ranch through the deep cold, which was not advisable and which she did anyway, and Cornelius met her on the road in his wagon coming to check that the road was passable, which she suspected was also an excuse to find her. He stopped the wagon. She stopped walking. They looked at each other across the white silence of the aftermath. "You walked from town," he said. "The road was manageable," she said. "It was not manageable," he said. "It is 4 miles of iced-over ruts." "I managed it," she said. He was looking at her with that expression she had given up trying to name, the one that was everything he would not say compressed into the particular way his eyes held on her. "Why did you walk out here?" he said. She took a breath of the cold air and said, "Because I wanted to see you." He got down from the wagon. He moved through the snow toward her with the deliberateness of someone who has made a decision and has stopped second-guessing it. And he stopped in front of her and looked down at her face, and then did what she had been waiting for since December, which was to cup her face in both of his big, cold, rough hands and kiss her. It was not a tentative kiss. It was the kiss of a man who had been thinking about this for a long time and knew exactly how he felt about it. And Eva kissed him back with the same certainty, and it tasted like cold air and coffee, and the particular relief of a thing that has been forbidden finally being allowed. He pulled back first, barely, just enough to look at her face. "Eva," he said. Her name in his voice for the first time, no Miss Reed, just Eva, and it was one of the finest things she had ever heard. "Yes," she said, which was the answer to everything he had said and everything he had not. He drove her back to town in the wagon, and she sat beside him on the bench with his arm around her shoulders, because the cold was real, and the excuse was welcome, and they talked about nothing important for the entire 4 miles, about the sky and the snow and what the spring might look like, and it was the best conversation she could remember having. After that, things were still careful because the town was watching, and because they were both careful people by nature, but they were also different because there was no longer any uncertainty about where they stood. He called her Eva. She called him Cornelius. He still walked her out to her accommodations in the evenings, and they still stood talking at the gate for longer than was strictly necessary. But now sometimes he held her hand in the dark where the lamplight did not reach, and it was small and private and exactly right. Adelaide and Eli noticed the change immediately because children always do, and because they were not, as previously established, children who missed things. Adelaide became slightly more deliberate in her expressions of fondness toward Eva, which in Adelaide's case meant she occasionally said things like, "Your explanation of the water cycle was actually very good," rather than simply looking as though she thought it but was saving it for later. Eli began a campaign of what Eva recognized as extremely strategic helpfulness toward both of them, finding reasons to leave them alone together, finding reasons to engineer their proximity, finding reasons to hold both of their hands simultaneously when they were walking, so that their hands ended up near each other. It was, Eva thought, the most transparent matchmaking scheme in history, and the fact that she and Cornelius were already matched only made it funnier and more endearing. March arrived with the first hints of thaw, which in Montana mean that the snow becomes heavy instead of light, and the mud becomes absolute, and everything is simultaneously hopeful and very difficult. Eva's original contract with the school board extended to the end of April. She had written to the Boston school declining the position. She had written to her sister explaining that she was staying in Montana for a while longer, which her sister had responded to with a letter of magnificent curiosity and barely concealed delight. She had not told Cornelius about the letter to Boston. She was not sure why. Perhaps she was waiting for him to ask again. Perhaps she was waiting to be certain enough to say it out loud. He asked in late March, on a Sunday afternoon when they had walked out along the creek together, which was partly frozen still but talking to itself quietly under the ice, the way creeks do in early spring. Adelaide was at Margaret Holt's helping with some baking project. Eli was with Duff, the ranch hand, doing something with the horses. They had an hour of unstructured time, which was unusual, and they used it to walk and to talk and to do the thing they had become good at, which was being near each other. "Your contract ends in 6 weeks, he said. He was looking at the creek. "Yes," she said. "What will you do?" he said. She stopped walking. He stopped because she did. They stood in the early March cold with the creek whispering under its ice and the mountains massive and white above the tree line. "I want to stay," she said. "I have already told Boston I am not coming." He turned to look at her slowly. "When did you do that?" "February," she said. Something happened in his face. "You did not tell me." "No," she said. "Why not?" She thought about this honestly. "Because I wanted to decide it for myself first," she said. "Not because you asked, not because the children needed me, though they do, because I chose it, because I wanted to know I was choosing it for my own reasons and not someone else's." He was very still for a moment. Then he said, "That is the most Eva Reed answer I have ever heard." "I know," she said. "I love you," he said. It came out simply, without preamble, without any careful approach, just the plain fact of it. She looked at him. "I love you," she said back, also simple, also plain because it was. He pulled her into his arms, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and felt his arms around her, and the creek whispering, and the cold air moving, and the massive, indifferent beauty of the mountains all around them. And she thought that she had been afraid of getting this wrong, and here it was right, and it felt like coming out of something into open air. The proposal happened in April, which she had not known to expect in April, and she would later describe to her sister as something she would put in a book if she wrote books, which she might. She had been thinking about it. She had gone to the ranch as usual on a Saturday morning. Adelaide and Eli were both at the kitchen table when she came in, with their school books in front of them and their expressions identical in their studied nonchalance, which told her immediately that they had been arranged there by someone and were trying to seem as though they had not. Cornelius came in from outside a few moments later and said, with the slightly formal air of a man who has rehearsed what he is about to do and is now carrying out the plan whether it feels natural or not, "Addie and Eli, perhaps you could work on your lessons for a little while." "We are already working on our lessons," Adelaide said, which was not entirely true because Eli's book was upside down. "Good," Cornelius said. "Keep doing that." He looked at Eva with a very slight, very controlled expression that was asking her to come outside with him, and she followed him out onto the porch where the April sun was making a genuine effort, and the mud in the yard had the hopeful quality of earth that means to be solid again soon. He reached into his jacket pocket and brought out a small ring, which he held in his palm in a completely unceremonial way that was entirely in character and therefore entirely moving. "This was my grandmother's," he said. "My mother left it to me for when I needed it." Eva looked at the ring. It was a simple gold band with a small oval garnet set in it, deep red, exactly the color of the mountains in evening light. "I am going to ask you," he said, "and I want to say first that I know what I am asking. I know it means you stay here with this land and this cold and this particular difficult life, and I know that is not nothing. I know you had other things planned. I know you are giving something up. And I know that you would not be doing it for nothing, but I want to say it plainly. I would spend the rest of my life making certain it was not a sacrifice, that you were not smaller here, that everything you are had room to be what it is." She was looking at his face while he said this. He was not looking at the ring or at the mountains or at the porch boards. He was looking at her, straight and direct and entirely without armor. "I love you," he said. "I want you to be my wife. I want my children to have you as their mother, and I want you to want that too, not out of feeling sorry for them or feeling obligated to them, but genuinely because you choose it. Will you?" "Yes," she said. "Cornelius, yes." He put the ring on her finger, and then she kissed him properly in the April sunlight on the porch of the ranch house. And then there was a sound from inside that was both children trying very hard not to make noise and failing completely. "They already know," she said against his mouth. "They have known since December," he said. "Eli," she said. "Addie," he said. Actually, Eli was obvious about it. Addie was strategic. She laughed, and he laughed with her, and it was the best sound she had heard all year. When they went back inside, Adelaide was sitting with her hands folded on the table in the manner of someone who had been carefully composed in advance. Eli had given up entirely on composure and was standing on his chair. "Did you say yes?" Eli said. "I said yes," Eva said. Eli made a sound that could only be described as a whoop and launched himself off the chair in Eva's general direction. She caught him mostly, and he threw his arms around her neck with the wholehearted, uncomplicated abandon of a 7-year-old who has got the thing he wanted. Adelaide did not whoop. Adelaide was not a whooping child. But she slid off her chair and walked over and put her arms around Eva's waist and pressed her face against Eva's side and did not say anything, which was better than anything she could have said because it was Adelaide, and it was real. The letter she and Eli had written and left on Eva's desk that same morning. The letter Eva had found before coming to the ranch. The letter that had started all of this rushing back to her. The letter that had made her hands shake with the enormity of being loved by two small people who had every reason to protect themselves from new attachments, and had decided, quietly and decisively, to love her anyway. That letter now made complete and full sense. They had written it because they were afraid she was going to leave before their father asked. They had written it as a preemptive action. They had written it because they were Clara Monroe's children and Cornelius Monroe's children, which meant they were not people who waited and hoped quietly when they could also take a definitive step. Eva held them both and looked at Cornelius over Adelaide's head, and he looked back at her with his whole face open and warm and something like peace in his eyes that she thought had not been there for a very long time, and she thought, firmly and simply and without reservation, "This is right. This is where I chose to be. This is mine." They were married in June of 1884 in the church of Garnet Creek, in front of everyone the town had, which was not a great number but was a warm number. Reverend Birch performed the ceremony with great satisfaction and slightly more dramatic pauses than were strictly necessary. Margaret Holt cried with the unself-conscious pleasure of a woman who has been rooting for something for months and is now watching it succeed. Adelaide stood very straight in her best dress and held the small bouquet of wildflowers that Eva had gathered that morning from the meadow below the ranch. Eli stood beside his father with his hair combed into a shape it immediately began departing from, and an expression of concentrated solemnity that lasted until the moment Eva and Cornelius exchanged their vows, at which point he gave a very small, satisfied nod and visibly relaxed. Eva wore a dress she had made with Margaret's help from blue wool that made her eyes look like the sky on a clear October afternoon, and she walked down the aisle of the little church toward Cornelius Monroe, who was standing at the front with his hat in his hands and his jaw set, and his eyes on her face. And for a moment she thought that this was the clearest possible version of all the things she had been uncertain about and afraid of and working toward. This man with his careful hands and his hidden warmth and his children, who had written her a letter asking her to stay because they had already decided she was theirs. He held her hand through the vows. When Reverend Birch said he could kiss his bride, Cornelius did, with the same completeness and certainty as the first time in the February snow, and the church applauded, which surprised him slightly and made her smile against his mouth. The summer after the wedding was the best summer Eva Reed Monroe could remember. The ranch in summer was a different world from the ranch in winter. It was alive in a way that winter makes you forget is possible, and she walked its fields and its creek banks and its high meadows with a sense of belonging that was new and complete and absolutely hers. She taught the summer informal lessons that she ran 2 mornings a week at the schoolhouse for children who wanted to keep learning during the break, which was not all of them but was enough, and in the afternoon she was home. She thought about that word, home. She had grown up in a home in Cincinnati, and she had made herself comfortable in temporary homes in the years since, and she had not expected to find a new home at 28 in Montana, but here it was, entirely specific and unarguable. This house with its lace curtains that had been Clara's and that she had kept because they were beautiful. This kitchen where the coffee was always slightly too strong. This porch where the evenings were best. These mountains that she had learned to read like a language, their moods in the cloud cover and the light and the way the wind came down off the high places. Cornelius was different in the summer. Not different at the core, he was always himself, always the particular combination of contained and deep that she loved, but he was lighter. He laughed more, full real laughter rather than the fractional warmth she had first learned to notice. He talked more. He touched her with an ease and naturalness that spoke of someone who had remembered that there was joy in physical warmth, in the casual, everyday proximity of the person you love. He would find her on the porch in the evening and sit behind her, and she would lean against him, and they would watch the light change on the mountains and say nothing for long stretches because silence with him was one of the good kinds. He was also, she noted with deep satisfaction, an excellent father who was becoming even better now that some weight had lifted from him. He wrestled with Eli in the yard and let himself be beaten approximately half the time, which Eli knew was letting, and which he appreciated because it was honest, and also because the half the time he genuinely won was all the more real. He taught Adelaide to ride the horse she had named Persephone, which was an extremely Adelaide choice of name, and he was patient with her stubbornness in learning and proud of her when she got it right and said so out loud, which was the important part. The fall term of 1885 brought new students and Eva's second year of teaching at the Garnet Creek school, which she now ran with more confidence and better supplies because she had written to the territorial board and argued, persuasively and at some length, for funding, and had received a partial response. She got new readers. She got arithmetic workbooks. She got a globe, which Eli regarded as the most wonderful object ever manufactured, and which she let him carry to his desk on the first day of school and explain to the other children. Adelaide, now 10 years old, had taken on an unofficial role as the older student who helped the youngest ones, which she performed with the characteristic Adelaide combination of high standards and genuine care that drove the younger children slightly crazy, and also kept them learning faster than they otherwise would have. Eva watched her with the private knowledge that Adelaide Monroe was going to do something important someday, had the intelligence and the drive and the particular quality of caring about excellence not as performance but as substance, and that the most important thing Eva could do was make sure she knew it. On a Tuesday afternoon in October of 1885, exactly a year after the roof caught fire and Cornelius had been on it before everyone else, Eva sat at her desk after the children had gone and looked at the ring on her finger, the garnet ring that had been a grandmother's, and felt the accumulation of a year as something warm and solid and hers. She was going to have a baby. She had known for 3 weeks and had not yet told Cornelius because she was waiting for the right moment, which was a slightly irrational thing to wait for but which felt important. She told him that evening. They were on the porch in the October dark, which was already cold, and she told him plainly because she had learned that plainness was the language he trusted. He was very still for a moment. Then he put his hands on either side of her face and looked at her with an expression so full and complex and tender that she felt it like something physical. "Are you well?" he asked first, because that was the first thing always with him. "I am very well," she said. He kissed her forehead and then her mouth, and then he said, roughly into her hair, "Eva." "I know," she said. They told the children the next morning at breakfast. Eli's response was immediate and comprehensive joy. Adelaide's response was to go very quiet for a moment and then look at Eva with an expression that was so like her father's expression from the previous evening, so full and careful and wanting, that Eva reached across the table and took her hand. "You are not being replaced," Eva said. "That is not a thing that happens. There is not a finite amount of room." Adelaide looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "I know that," in a tone that meant she had needed to hear it said anyway, which Eva understood completely. The winter of 1885 into 1886 was long, and Cornelius did not let Eva do anything he considered unreasonable, and Eva negotiated with him continuously about what unreasonable meant, which was an ongoing and productive discussion because he listened, and she was practical, and they generally arrived at something workable. Margaret Holt came to the ranch regularly and was indispensable and clearly delighted. Reverend Birch prayed over the situation with considerable enthusiasm. In March of 1886, on a night when the wind was doing something large outside and the house was very warm within, Eva had her baby, a boy, as it turned out, small and emphatic and possessed of a truly impressive set of lungs and a dark cap of hair like his father's. Cornelius held him with the particular careful intensity of a man who understands the weight of what he is holding, who has done this before and knows it gets more astonishing rather than less. His hands were so careful. His face was so completely open and present and overcome, and Eva watched him from the bed and felt the particular compound love of seeing the person you love become something even more of what they already are. "What will we call him?" she said. They had been discussing names for 2 months without settling on one. They had a list. The list was very long because Eli had added to it enthusiastically, and some of his suggestions had been extremely creative. Cornelius looked up at her. "What do you want?" She had thought about this carefully. "James," she said. "For my father," he nodded. "James Monroe." "James Daniel Monroe," she said. "Daniel for yours." He went very still for a moment. His father's name. She had remembered. He looked at her with the full force of everything he was, and said nothing because there was nothing adequate, and she understood that and nodded, and he looked back at the baby and said, to the baby specifically, "James Daniel Monroe. That is a significant name to grow into." Adelaide held her new brother that morning with the exquisite care of someone who has been waiting to be trusted with something precious and means to prove it was the right call. Eli sat beside her and narrated the baby's expressions, which he said were very communicative and mostly about milk. Eva closed her eyes for a while and listened to her family existing around her. The sound of Cornelius's voice and the children's voices, and the small emphatic sounds of James Daniel Monroe announcing his presence in the world. And she thought about the letter that had started it all. The letter she had kept. The small square of folded paper in Adelaide's careful handwriting and Eli's enthusiastic supplement. And she thought about how she had come to Garnet Creek to teach one season, fully intending to leave. She thought about how the children had quietly decided on something permanent instead, before their father had said it plainly, before the February snow and the ring and the June wedding. They had seen it and named it and written it down in their own handwriting and asked her to stay. And they had been so simply and completely right that the only thing she could say about her own hesitation was that she had needed to arrive at it in her own way, and she had, and here she was. Here she was. Spring came to Garnet Creek in 1886, the way it always did, slowly and then suddenly, the snow retreating up the mountains and the creek opening fully, and the meadows turning green with the particular intensity of green that follows white for months. Eva went back to teaching in April, which caused some discussion in the town about the propriety of it, and which she addressed by continuing to teach and letting the discussion resolve itself at its own pace, which it did, because she was excellent at it, and the children were learning, and those were the actual relevant facts. James Monroe stayed at the ranch with Duff's wife, Maria, who was warm and capable and treated him with the calm competence of a woman who had raised her own children and knew that babies are tough and adaptable and do not require constant anxiety. When school let out, Eva came back to the ranch, and James Monroe received the information of her return by banging his small fists on whatever surface was available, which Maria assured her was an expression of enthusiasm. 2 years later, in 1888, the Garnet Creek School had grown to 14 students, and Eva had successfully argued the territorial board into funding a second room, which she used for the older children while the younger ones worked at the front of the main room. Adelaide Monroe, now 12, was so advanced that Eva had begun giving her university-level reading materials that she ordered by catalog from Helena. Adelaide consumed them with the focused appetite of someone who had been waiting for the food to arrive. Cornelius had expanded the ranch by purchasing the adjacent acreage from the Callaway family who were moving to Oregon, which meant more cattle and more work and 2 additional hands, but it also meant the ranch was finally solvent in the way that allowed for something beyond bare maintenance. He fixed the porch roof that had needed fixing for 2 years. He got a new team of horses. He sent to Helena for a proper cookstove that did not behave unpredictably, which was Eva's most practical and most celebrated request. On their 3rd wedding anniversary, June of 1887, he had taken her out to the high meadow above the ranch, the one that looked out over the valley with the mountains on 3 sides and the evening sky going orange and pink and a deep saturated blue above, and they had sat there in the long grass while the last light lasted, and he had said, quietly and specifically, "You gave up the Boston school." "I gave up a version of my life," she said. "I traded it for a different one. Do you regret it?" She looked at him fully, with the same directness she had always used with him because he had always been able to handle it. "Not for a single moment," she said. "Not for one breath of one moment." He took her hand and held it, and they watched the light go down on the mountains together. The autumn of 1888 brought a surprise in the form of another letter, this one from Eva's sister Caroline, announcing that she was coming to visit. This news was received with complex emotions by Eva, uncomplicated delight by Eli, and calculating interest by Adelaide, who had heard a great deal about Aunt Caroline and had privately assessed her potential as an ally and intellectual companion. Caroline Reed arrived in October, looking at Montana with the enormous eyes of a person encountering a landscape that defies their previous understanding of scale. She was 26, practical, quick-witted, and initially somewhat at a loss for how to proceed with Cornelius Monroe, who was exactly as he presented himself, which was not what she had been expecting. "He is very large," Caroline whispered to Eva on the first evening. "Tall," Eva said. "He is very tall." "And very quiet," Caroline said. "He says what he means," Eva said. "He is just selective about when there is something to say." Caroline spent 2 weeks at the ranch, and by the end she had revised her initial assessment significantly upward, partly because of witnessing Cornelius and Eva together in the ordinary, everyday way of a couple who have built something real, and partly because of Adelaide, who she declared the most interesting 12-year-old she had ever met, and with whom she had apparently had a conversation about the rights of women that Eva would have paid money to hear. She also observed, with sisterly insight, that Eva was exceptionally happy, which she reported back to Ohio in a letter that later made their mother cry, in the good way. In the winter of 1889, Eva discovered she was expecting again. This was received by the entire household with the same combination of joy and organized preparation as before, but with more confidence and less anxiety, because they knew how this worked now. They had James, who was 3 years old and extremely certain of his own opinions, and running competently through the life of the ranch with the conviction of someone who knows he is beloved. The baby came in July of 1889. A girl this time, which surprised no one who believed in the complete unpredictability of such things. They named her Clara, which was Eva's idea and which she had brought to Cornelius carefully because she was not certain how it would land. He had been very still for a moment when she suggested it. Then he had said, "Are you certain?" "Clara was their mother," Eva said. "She is part of them and part of this place. I am not trying to erase her. I would not want to. The name should be remembered." He had looked at her for a long moment with the expression she had learned to read as being moved past the point where words worked well. "Clara Grace Monroe," he said finally, "after his wife, after his daughter. After something continuous and held and honored." "Clara Grace," Eva agreed. When Adelaide held her baby sister for the first time and saw her name, heard it said aloud, she looked at Eva with an expression that was so entirely without the careful containment she usually applied to her feelings that Eva had to look away for a moment. "Thank you," Adelaide said, quietly, directly, in exactly the way her father said things. "She is her own person," Eva said. "The name is just a beginning." By 1890, Garnet Creek had grown. The railroad had come closer to the valley, not directly through the town but close enough to matter, and with it came new families and new businesses and new pressure on the school, which Eva addressed by writing to the territorial board again, this time at greater length and with greater force, and receiving in response a full grant for expansion and an invitation to submit her curriculum as a model for rural schools in the territory. She worked on that curriculum through the winter evenings at the kitchen table, with Cornelius across from her reading his books, and James building things on the floor and occasionally needing to be retrieved from under the table, and Clara Grace asleep in the wooden cradle Cornelius had made, and Adelaide doing her own advanced work in her room, and Eli, now 12, doing math problems that Eva had ordered from a special catalog and that he was doing, she noted with delight. With genuine enthusiasm for their own sake and not just for her approval, the curriculum she submitted was approved. The territorial school inspector, a man named Harold Birchwood who had not expected to be impressed by a rural school in Garnet Creek, Montana, was sufficiently impressed to say so in writing, which was not Harold Birchwood's natural mode, and which Eva received with the controlled satisfaction of someone who had known they were right about something and was pleased to have the confirmation. Adelaide Monroe, in 1892, when she was 16, began corresponding with a women's college in the East about their requirements for admission. She did this without telling her father first because she was afraid of what he would say, and when he found out, Eva was present for the conversation and watched Cornelius Monroe ask his daughter careful, specific questions about what she wanted, and why, and what she understood about the difficulty, and listened to Adelaide answer them with clarity and passion and the completely undefended earnestness of someone making her real case to someone she trusts to hear it. He said yes. He said he would find the money. He said he was proud of her in the particular Cornelius way that meant he said it once and meant it completely, and she would remember it longer than if he had said it 50 times. Adelaide, who was not a crying person, looked for a moment as though she might become one. Then she composed herself and said, "Thank you, Papa," in the same tone she had thanked Eva for her sister's name, and Cornelius pulled her into a hug that she accepted with the absolute surrender of someone who has learned that being held by someone who loves you is not a weakness. Eli, watching all of this from the doorway, said to Eva quietly, "She has been scared to ask him for 2 months." "I know," Eva said. "Why is being scared sometimes useful?" Eli asked, which was the kind of question Eli had always asked, the suddenly sideways question that required a real answer. "Because it means you care enough about something that losing it would hurt," Eva said. "Things worth having are usually worth being afraid of." He thought about this with the focused attention he brought to things that interested him. "That is a good answer," he said. "Thank you," she said. "You have gotten better at those," he said, in the tone of someone handing out a meaningful compliment. 13 years of practice," she said. He grinned, and it was the same grin as the first day, the gap-toothed 7-year-old who had asked her if she knew any stories, and she loved him so fiercely in that moment that she had to laugh to let it out. The spring of 1894 brought 2 things that happened close enough together that Eva would always remember them as connected. The first was Adelaide's departure for the East and the Women's College, which was a morning full of practical preparation, and then a moment at the wagon when Adelaide held James, who was 8, and Clara Grace, who was 5, and then hugged Eli for a long time, and then turned to Eva. She did not say anything. She just held on properly, the way she had learned to hold on without holding back. Eva held her with equal strength and thought about the 9-year-old who had looked at her on the first day of school with the thorough skepticism of someone who had been disappointed before, and thought about the letter and thought about all of it and said into Adelaide's hair, "You are going to do extraordinary things." "I know," Adelaide said, "exactly right. Not boasting, just true." She hugged her father last. They stood at the wagon for a long time. Eva looked away to give them privacy and saw Eli wiping his face on his sleeve and pretending not to and looked away from that too. Then Adelaide was on the stage and gone. Cornelius was quiet for the rest of the morning, and Eva sat close beside him at the kitchen table and passed him coffee, and did not attempt to fill the silence with reassurance he did not need, because she knew him well enough to know that what he needed was to feel it move through him without being redirected, and that she could simply be there, which she was. In the afternoon he found her in the garden where she was doing something vigorous with a hoe because she worked physically when she had feelings to process, and he came and stood beside her for a moment and then said, "We did something right with her." "We did," Eva said. "You especially." "You," he said. "Us," she said. "It was always us." He put his arm around her shoulders, and they stood in the garden in the warm spring afternoon, and it was quiet and full and good. The second thing that happened that spring was that Eli, who was now 19 years old and had been working the ranch alongside his father since he was 15 with the same natural competence that Cornelius had, and a natural delight in it that his father had perhaps always had but had kept quiet, told them at supper one evening that he was thinking of putting in for the land that was coming up for sale on the east edge of the valley. Cornelius looked up from his plate. "Starting your own spread." "Thinking about it," Eli said. He was trying to seem casual and was not quite managing it, which was so Eli that it was its entirety endearing. "If you could stand to not have me around." "We could manage," Eva said, straight-faced. Eli looked at her with his grin. "The land is good," Cornelius said in the tone he used when he was being practical about something he felt emotional about. "I know those acres. I looked at them myself when we expanded. The creek access is good. You would need to build." "I know," Eli said. "I thought I might build first, work the land for a year before I stock it." Cornelius was quiet for a moment. Eva watched him processing something, watched the particular movement of his face that meant he was arriving at something from the inside. "I will help you build," he said. Eli looked at his father and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "I was hoping you would say that." Clara Grace, 5 years old and deeply invested in any conversation she could follow, said, "Will you still come for Sunday dinner?" "Every Sunday," Eli said. "Without fail." "Good," she said, satisfied, and went back to her food. James said, "Can I help build too?" He was 8 years old and had recently become very interested in the structural properties of things. "I would count on it," Eli said. Eva looked around the supper table at the 5 of them, at Cornelius and Eli deep in a conversation about land and building, and the particular Montana knowledge that passes from one generation to the next, at James with his eyes bright, and his food going cold because he was thinking about structure, at Clara Grace, who was doing something decisive with her spoon. And she thought about September of 1884 and the stagecoach and the first sight of this man and his 2 children and the single season she had planned to be here. 10 years. She had been here 10 years. She had taught hundreds of children in those 10 years, had written a curriculum that other schools used, had learned Montana through its seasons and its light and its impossible winters and its brief, brilliant summers. She had built a marriage out of honesty and effort, and the particular daily choice to know another person all the way through rather than only to the comfortable edges. She had been a mother to 4 children, 2 given to her and 2 born to her, and each of them was different and specific and entirely themselves, and she would not have simplified any of them for anything. She had not made herself smaller. This had been her choice, and she had made it fully, with both hands and with full knowledge, and it had given her more than she had known to plan for. After supper, after the children were occupied with their respective evenings, Eli at the table with his land papers, James in bed with his book, Clara Grace asleep in the way of young children who simply stop and drop off wherever they happen to be, Eva found Cornelius on the porch. Of course she found him on the porch. That was where the evenings went always, had always since that first summer. She stood beside him and he put his arm around her and she leaned against him and they looked out at the dark valley with the stars enormous overhead the way they get at altitude and in the absence of competing light. "Our son is going to have a ranch," he said. "He is going to have a life," she said. "The ranch is just the container." He turned his head to look at her in the dark. "That is a very Eva Reed thing to say." "Eva Monroe," she said. "Eva Monroe," he said, and the warmth in his voice when he said it was the same warmth it had always had, not diminished by 10 years but deepened, made more specific, made more true. She tilted her head up and kissed him, and he kissed her back with the comfortable ease of 2 people who have had 10 years of practice and have not gotten bored of it. And then they stood together in the Montana dark and listened to the night. Eli bought his land in the summer of 1894, and Cornelius helped him build his house through the fall, and James helped in every way that a 9-year-old with opinions about structure could help. and Eva brought food out to the building site on Saturdays and watched the two Monroe men work together with the recognition that this was what Cornelius had been building toward since Clara died, and he had realized that what he was building was still alive and still his responsibility. The house was finished by early winter, small and solid and well-made, and Eli moved into it with the particular mix of pride and terror that accompanies the first night alone in a thing you have made, and was at the Monroe Ranch for Sunday dinner that week and every week after, true to his word to Clara Grace. Adelaide wrote letters from the East. Long, specific, articulate letters about her courses and her professors and the other women she was meeting, and the ideas she was encountering and the arguments she was having, which were apparently numerous. She mentioned in one letter with the careful casualness of someone mentioning something important in passing, corresponding with a young man she had met at a lecture, the son of a professor, who was interested in law and who she said had the unusual quality of listening when she talked rather than waiting for her to stop. Eva wrote back that this was an excellent quality in a person and worth noting. Cornelius wrote back that he wanted to know more about this young man. Adelaide wrote that his name was William Garrett. He was 22, he was from Philadelphia, and she was not making any announcements at this time, but she wanted them to know he existed. Eva told Cornelius this was Adelaide's way of saying something significant while maintaining control of the situation. He said he was aware of that. He said he trusted Adelaide's judgment. He said this in a way that meant it cost him something to say it, and that he was saying it anyway because it was right. And Eva loved him very much in that moment for the specific quality of honesty it required. In 1896, 12 years after Eva Reed had stepped off a stagecoach in Garnet Creek with 2 trunks and a single-season plan, Adelaide Monroe came home for the summer with her degree, and with William Garrett, who was tall and careful and clearly somewhat intimidated by Cornelius Monroe, which was understandable, and which Cornelius addressed by asking him direct, quiet questions about his intentions and his character, and his actual knowledge of who Adelaide was, and which William Garrett answered with a straightness and seriousness that eventually satisfied Cornelius Monroe's standard, which was high. Adelaide married William Garrett in the Garnet Creek Church in August of 1896, 12 years after her father had married Eva in the same church. Reverend Birch was by then 82 years old and had never enjoyed officiating a ceremony more. The whole town came. Eli was there with a young woman he had been quietly keeping company with for 6 months, a rancher's daughter named Ruth, who had the clear-eyed practicality of a person who understood what ranch life was and had chosen it fully, and Eva noted this with private satisfaction. James Monroe, now 10, delivered the rings with a solemnity that he had been practicing for a week, and Clara Grace, 7 years old, was the flower girl, and performed this function with the particular intensity of someone who understood she had been given an important job and intended to execute it flawlessly. Eva stood at the front of the church beside Cornelius and watched Adelaide Monroe walk toward her husband with the upright, specific, entirely herself quality that she had had since she was 9 years old, and had assessed Eva on the first day with her arms crossed and her jaw set, and her heart carefully defended. And she thought about all the things Adelaide Monroe was, and all the ways she had become more of them over the years, and she was so proud it was almost pain. After the wedding, there was a celebration that lasted into the evening, with the fiddle players and dancing and the particular warmth of a whole community in a small church hall being happy together. And Cornelius danced with Eva in the same not-quite dancing way they had first found at the Christmas social of 1884, close and easy, and she said against his shoulder, "I came here to teach 1 season." "I know," he said. "Adelaide and Eli had already decided before I did," she said. "I know," he said. "I figured it out eventually." "You were last," she said. "I was not last," he said. "I was second." She lifted her head to look at him. "The letter," she said. "What letter?" "The letter they wrote me," she said. On the last day of autumn 1884, asking me to stay and telling me you were sad and that they already loved me. I was going to show it to you." He looked at her with a complex expression. "I did not know about the letter." "They wrote it in secret," she said. "Addie organized it. Eli contributed enthusiastically." He was quiet for a moment, processing. "What did they say?" she told him. She remembered it well enough to quote the relevant parts. The way it said, "You make the house smell like something good." The way it said, "We think you could love us if you tried, and we already love you, so it is a good start." He looked somewhere over her head for a moment in the way he looked when he was moved past the point of easy expression. "She was 9 years old," he said. "She was also right," Eva said. "She was always right about the important things," he said. "That was always the thing about Adelaide." He held her a little closer, and they moved in the warm light of the church hall while the fiddles played, and around them the whole town of Garnet Creek was alive and celebrating. And outside, the Montana night was enormous and full of stars. And everything they had built together over 12 years of seasons was solid and real and present. And Eva Reed Monroe, who had come to teach one season and had been kept by something larger and more permanent than any single season, was entirely and irrevocably home. Eli Monroe married Ruth Calloway in the spring of 1897, in the same church, with the same reverend, who was now 83, and conducted the ceremony with the absolute triumph of a man who has been watching these young people since they were small and is deeply satisfied with how they have turned out. Cornelius walked his son to the front of the church rather than Eli walking alone, which was not traditional but was exactly right, and they stood together for a moment before William Garrett arrived to stand with Eli, and Cornelius stepped to the side. And Eva saw Cornelius put his hand briefly on his son's shoulder and say something quiet that made Eli nod with his eyes bright. She did not hear what he said. She did not need to. The years settled into themselves with the comfortable rhythm of a life being fully lived. James Monroe, who had grown with the same thoroughness in every direction that characterized the Monroe family, showed a particular aptitude for engineering and mechanics that was encouraged by Eva and respected by Cornelius, and which eventually led to his going to study in Helena when he was 17, coming back with knowledge that he applied immediately and usefully to the ranch and the town both. Because James Monroe was practical at his core, and had very little patience for knowledge that stayed theoretical when it could be applied. Clara Grace Monroe grew up to be exactly herself, which was to say she was not Adelaide and not Eva and not Clara her namesake, but was entirely her own person, with her father's dark eyes and her mother's way with words, and a gift for music that surprised everyone because neither parent was musical, and it appeared to have arrived from somewhere in the general direction of Providence. By the time she was 12, she could play the piano that the church had finally acquired, and play it well, and the whole town of Garnet Creek considered this an excellent development. And Eva Monroe taught the Garnet Creek School. Year after year, through the expansion of the territory and the creation of the state of Montana in 1889, and the growth of the town and the cycles of good years and difficult years and drought years and abundant years, she was not the same teacher she had been in September of 1884, nervous and certain simultaneously, with her 2 trunks and her single-season plan. She was better. She was the person who had lived in the place long enough to know what the children needed, who understood the particular combination of difficulty and possibility that was a life in Montana, and taught toward it rather than around it, who had produced, over more than a decade, a generation of Garnet Creek children who could read and calculate and think, and who knew something about the world beyond their valley because she had made certain of it. The curriculum she had developed was being used in 12 rural schools across Montana by 1895. She received a letter from the territorial school superintendent acknowledging this, which she read once, felt proud, and then put in the drawer with the other things she kept. Also in the drawer was Adelaide's letter. She had kept it all the years since that morning in November 1884 when she had found it on her desk and her hands had shaken and the train ticket had been in her bag and she had not yet known what she was going to do. She took it out sometimes and read it. Not often. Just when she wanted to remember the beginning with perfect clarity, the childish handwriting, the earnest argument, the completely unsentimental conclusion. We think you could love us if you tried, and we already love you, so it is a good start. What a beginning! What an extraordinary beginning! On the 20th anniversary of her arrival in Garnet Creek, September of 1904, Eva Monroe was 48 years old and Cornelius Monroe was 56, and they were sitting on the porch in the September evening light that she had always loved best, the long golden late afternoon light that made the mountains look as though they were made of something warm. He had known what day it was. He had mentioned it at breakfast, simply and specifically, which was his way. 20 years ago today, he had said, looking up from his coffee. 20 years ago today, she had said. They had not made a large occasion of it because neither of them required a large occasion for the things that mattered most. They had simply let the day be what it was, which was Thursday, an ordinary day, school in the morning and ranch work for him and supper together in the evening, and now the porch in the last of the light. Clara Grace was at the church practicing the piano, which she did on Thursday evenings. James was in Helena but sent a letter regularly and was coming for Christmas. Adelaide and William lived in Philadelphia now, where Adelaide taught at a women's college and William practiced law, and they had 2 children of their own, a boy of 7 named Thomas and a girl of 4 named Eva, the latter of which had caused Eva Monroe to cry without any warning when she received the letter announcing the name, and which Cornelius had handled with characteristic grace by simply sitting beside her and letting her cry. Eli and Ruth had the ranch on the east side of the valley and 3 children, and a contentment that was evident every Sunday when they came for dinner, which they still did, true to Eli's word to Clara Grace in 1894, 20 years not having diminished the habit. The porch in the September evening light, the mountains going gold, his arm around her, her head on his shoulder. "Do you remember what you said to me on the first day?" Eva asked. "I said Miss Reed," Cornelius said. "That is all you said," she said. "It seemed like enough," he said. "It was infuriating," she said. "I know," he said. She could hear the smile in his voice. "You were watching me the entire time," she said. "You were worth watching," he said. She tilted her head up and looked at him in the evening light. 20 years of evenings. The familiar lines of his face, changed by 20 years but fundamentally unchanged. Still the same face she had first seen, with the hat in the hands and the jaw set, and the children pressed against his legs. The same contained and serious and quietly, enormously warm face that she had been reading since the beginning like a language she had learned, and never stopped wanting to know better. "Cornelius," she said. "Eva," he said, her name in his voice, still the finest thing she heard regularly. "I am so glad I stayed," she said. He turned to look at her fully, the way he had always looked at her when he was giving the full weight of his attention, which was considerable and was always an honor. "So am I," he said, "every single day." He kissed her in the September evening on the porch of the house they had built together, and the mountains stood enormous and indifferent and heartbreakingly beautiful above the valley, and the last light went gold and then amber, and then the soft dark came in from the east, and in the dark the stars came out over Montana the way they always did, enormous and innumerable and completely certain of themselves. Eva Monroe, who had come to teach one season and had been kept by something permanent instead, watched the stars come out over the mountains and felt the solid warmth of her husband beside her and thought, with the clear-eyed certainty of a person who has been paying attention, that some of the best things in a life are the things you did not plan, that arrive with the directness of children's handwriting on a folded piece of paper and ask you simply and honestly and without apology to stay. She had stayed. She was staying, she would stay. This was home, this was hers, this was everything.